Hi everybody. We are here today with something a little bit different. It's just post-Tudor, isn't it? Only slightly post-Tudor. So we are talking about the Gunpowder Plot. So I am here with Mike Ingram. I'm sure you remember Mike from some of the other videos that we've done, and he has very kindly agreed to talk to us today about this. Now, we actually had a bit of a conversation about this yesterday, and there is just so much more to this than I had anticipated. So Mike had the great idea. We're actually going to divide this into two parts. So the first will sort of be the essential story of what happened and how it unfolded and so forth. And then the second part will be sort of like all the backstories to what was happening, why it was happening, and the interrelationships of all the people involved in this, because they're quite substantial, really, aren't they?
Yes.
Yeah, basically. So I should have just anticipated the wealth of information that Mike was going to give me when we were chatting about this yesterday. And I was like, oh my God, this is just too much. I can't fit it all in one video. And that's when you said, why don't we make it two? So that was a very good idea. So just in case people haven't met you before, Mike, please just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, so Mike Ingram, I'm a historian, I'm an author. I also teach history, particularly medieval, but I do get involved in other periods as well, such as the Gunpowder Plot and other things around it.
Yes, and the Civil War, because we have.
And the Civil War, of course, yes. Yeah, one of my other hats is as a trustee of the NATO Battlefield Project. So. I got very much involved in it through that.
Yes, there's been quite a lot going on, and you're very heavily involved with all the history of Northampton as well, aren't you?
Yes, yeah, and there'll be a new book on that coming out.
Yes,
hopefully by Christmas.
Well, at the rate you're writing, you're doing very, very well. So you write about 1,000 books a week, don't you? Something like that.
Something like that, yes.
Yeah. Okay, so I think most people have obviously heard of the Gunpowder Plot, and we celebrate, or some people don't celebrate, or acknowledge and know of gunpowder fireworks night, or Guy Fawkes night, or whatever you want to call it. And I kind of guess I remember from my oldest doing this at school more recently, they kind of just say, well, you know, these people didn't like the king, they didn't like his religion, so they decided they were going to blow him up, and then it's Guy Fawkes, and 12 other people, and it didn't work, and they all went to prison, and then they died. And that's, you don't really get much substance to that, do you? And I suppose you're teaching this to children, but not many people then go ahead and learn a lot more, even about the fundamental story. So it starts with a chap called Robert Catesby. So what can you tell us about Robert Catesby?
Okay, so going back, if we start off by just talking about what happens, and then we'll come back and we'll look at the backstory of Catesby and the like. Otherwise, we're going to be here for 3 hours just talking about Catesby and won't get the story covered. So if we start the story really in February 1604, on my birthday actually, James denounced the Catholic Church. The reasons we'll explain more later on. 3 days later, he orders the Jesuits and all the Catholic priests to leave the country and starts reimposing the collection of fines for recusancy. It's this that then prompts Catesby to act for the first time. He invites Thomas Winter and John Wright into his house in Lambeth, where they discussed a plan to re-establish Catholicism in England by blowing up the House of Lords during the state opening of Parliament. So that's where it all starts. Winter then goes off to Flanders to inquire about Spanish support, and he hunts out Guy Fawkes. He was a committed Catholic who had served as a soldier and an engineer in the wars that were going on in the Netherlands, and the pair of them returned to England late in April 1604. The next ones we get to join is Thomas Percy, who's Catesby's friend, and John Wright's brother-in-law, who was introduced to the plot several weeks later. The first meeting they make of the conspirators as such took place on the 20th of May 1604, probably at the Duck and Drake Inn, which is just off the Strand. Catesby, Winter and Wright were then joined by Fawkes and Percy, Alone in a private room, the 5 plotters swore an oath of secrecy on the prayer book. By coincidence, or is it, because it's one of those questions that always remains sort of up in the air, Father John Gerard, the Jesuit priest, was celebrating Mass in the room next door. He denies all knowledge of what they were doing. But whether this is true is always one of those stories that, perhaps otherwise.
Did they take Mass with him afterwards?
Yes, they did. They did. So this makes you wonder whether this was the case.
It seems a bit unlikely, doesn't it?
It does a bit, and especially as Gerard was in hiding anyway, and this was all being done secret at the same time.
This is a very quick digression. The one that was being hidden by Catesby's cousin.
That's it. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Anyway, that just something just randomly popped into my head. Then I haven't even got that in my notes. So I don't know where I pulled that out from. So there was this plot. Now, technically speaking, I've heard this described as like the greatest act of terrorism up to this point, or possibly could have been ever on British soil or English soil, which sounds, initially I thought, that sounds a bit dramatic. But actually, when you look at all the people that would have been there, as it was a state opening of Parliament, all the dukes and the lords and the king and his son and other members of the royal family, you know, it really could have, had it succeeded, which was never massively likely, taken out and put a huge hole in the establishment. So it was a really grandiose plot, an idea of something that could happen. But I'm not sure how plausible it ever was. But obviously to Catesby, what do you think his train of thought was?
To be honest, I don't think he had one. He just had the grand idea. And at this point, he hadn't even worked out how he was going to do it. Not properly. And we'll talk about that in a minute, about how it nearly happened. He also has a number of other opportunities as well. Percy, patron, was the Earl of Northumberland, for example. And Percy was appointed to the Honourable Corps of the Gentlemen of Arms, which was basically 50 of the king's bodyguards. So Percy was in constant close contact with the king. If they just wanted to kill the king, Percy just had to get his sword out, basically. He was that permanently that close to him. So it's interesting why they didn't go down that route and follow that up.
I suppose just I got the impression from some of the conversation we had, but even before that, that there was a real thing that Catesby sort of desired a huge place in the history books, and just maybe a random assassination attempt wasn't going to be as satisfactory to him as just some massive, huge events that would go down in history in like a really shocking way.
Oh, exactly. When you look at his personality when we look at it in the second part, you'll see that he is this. Trying to think the best way to describe it. He's probably the last of the chivalric knights from the medieval period.
Okay.
He had this sense of honour and righteousness and all those things that the medieval knights used to have. And of course, they had long past their sell-by dates.
Yeah. So this plan kind of gets put into place. And now, just very briefly, a little bit about James VI, or James VI of Scotland, who became James I. Yes. So when, obviously, there was, with this, there's a sort of that Catholic and Protestant displacement that you see starting to, or the displacement of Catholics, you see all this starting to take place, don't you, during Henry VIII's reign, with the I can't speak, Mike, can you help me out here? The Reformation, I was going to say
Reformation, yes.
The Reformation. Yes. And a lot of people would say, well, okay, it all harked back to then this harmony, and some people might agree with that and some people not, but anyway, so very much now he was seen as a Protestant king, but I believe his wife had converted back to Catholicism. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And and he was actually quite open to relaxing some of the penalties that were placed upon the Catholics in society up to the point of him becoming king. You know, he wanted to kind of get that middle ground back, and the Catholics were hoping that him becoming king once Elizabeth died would give them some opportunities to have the restrictions on them maybe released a little bit, and they couldn't necessarily go out and be very, very flamboyant about their Catholicism, but they could live a much more comfortable and safer life.
Yes. Yeah. And that's what was expected.
Mm.
And that's why I think once, because the other thing we need to talk about at some point is the main plot and the by plot, which is all part of this story. But I think originally that he would have, he was trying to be open with everybody, and as he rides down from Scotland down to England, he knights one or two Catholics on the way down, which is what gives all the Catholics hope that he's going to be much more open and much more friendly towards them. But then, of course, with the main plot and the by-plot, that goes totally wrong, and there are some questions whether both of those plots were real or whether they were invented by Cecil to try and help persuade James that he shouldn't be supporting the Catholics. It's one of those open questions of what might it have been.
Oh, there's so many of those.
Yeah, and he was actually quite well known for that, by the looks of things.
Yeah. Okay, so the state opening of Parliament was due to take place in December.
Yeah, December the 24th, 1604 was when it was originally due to open.
So he had, obviously, Catesby and the others by extension, had that as a kind of time scale in their mind.
Yes. Yeah.
But there were some prorogations, you said, now more than I knew about. But then, of course, he's like, well, I've got a bit more time now.
Yes.
I can add to this a little bit. So to him, this probably seemed like a fantastic opportunity. But for us, with A, some hindsight, and B, a little bit more common sense, this just gives him more time to get things fundamentally wrong. And the first thing he does is, well, as I want to do a bit more, I'm going to tell a few more people about this.
Yeah. And he starts drawing more people into the plot.
Yeah, and that's never going to end well, is it? So at this point, he makes a decision about how to not just blow up Westminster, but to add on another part of the plot. So he makes a decision to do what exactly?
He eventually decides that they're going to capture the princess, James's daughter, and put her on as a puppet queen, and she was away from Parliament, so she was safe. And then the other one would have been obviously young Charles, and he would have been in Parliament with them, so he would have gone at the same time. The original plan, according to the prosecution in trials afterwards, was they were going to dig a tunnel underneath of Parliament and get in that way from one of the houses alongside of it. But of course, that's an interesting one because it might not have worked, especially as it was rather close to the Thames. It might have got full of water, but there has never been any evidence found of a tunnel ever being built. So it might have been another one of Cecil's stories. With it.
He has a few of those.
Yes.
But Thomas Percy managed to, he was renting some space, wasn't he? Which was quite a premium to come by.
Yes.
And he managed to rent a further amount of space for something like £4.
Yeah.
With like a cellar underneath.
That's it.
What was the old kitchen? And this was just obviously perfect because they could hide stuff away there. It would be perfectly legal. It wasn't particularly drawing any attention to themselves or anything like that. And they were able, therefore, to just kind of come and go and plot and stash without people taking a huge amount of notice of them.
Yeah, and so while all this was going on, the other part of the conspiracy was to capture Princess Elizabeth, and then ready to install her as the puppet queen. So it was a separate part of the plot that would be going on at the same time as the gunpowder stuff was going on at the same time.
I wonder. No, sorry, carry on. I'll come back in a minute.
So they actually start finalising this plot in October in a series of taverns across London and Daventry, and of course the famous one is the Gatehouse at Ashby St Ledger, which is in Northamptonshire, not Warwickshire, as some people think, because unfortunately Ashby St Ledger has got a Warwick postcode.
Oh.
So people think it's in Warwickshire, but it's not. It's in Northamptonshire.
We have an anomaly like that here with over at Bosworth and Sutton Chain around there. I think it's a Leicestershire postcode, isn't it? But
yeah.
It's not, or the other way around.
Yeah, it's a Warwickshire postcode.
Yeah, but it's technically classed anyway. Sorry, another sort of digression there.
Yeah. So they leased this house.
Yes.
And as we said, it's been the Parliament's been pro-road. The plot has purchased the undercroft underneath it. By this time, they got 3 more people joining the ranks. So you got Robert Winter. He owned Hudlington Court near Worcester. Christopher Wright, who's John's brother, and he'd have been one that took part in some other revolts and stuff that was going on. And John Grant was another one. He'd married Winter's sister, and we'll look at the whole family tree because every single one of these are connected. They're all cousins, and it's something that we tend to forget. Okay, so by this time, 3 more extra people have joined the conspiracy. Robert Winter, who inherited Huntington Court and was already a refuge for priests at the time near Worcester.
Oh, right.
And he also had huge amounts of money, which seemed to be getting more important to the whole plot. Christopher Wright then joins, who's John Wright's brother. And he lived in Twigmore in Lincolnshire. Again, already Twigmore was known as a haven for priests. Then John Grant, he was married to Winter's sister, and he had the manor of Norbrook near Stratford-on-Avon, and he had also been sheltering Catholics as well. So they all start to come together. But on the 28th of July, the threat of Parliament, threat of the plague, delays the opening of Parliament again. And this time it wouldn't be open until the 5th of November. By this time, in the Undercroft, under the House of Parliament, they'd already got the gunpowder already, but because they'd left it so long, it had decayed.
Oh my God.
And was no good. So they then had to get more gunpowder in to replace the stuff that lost. And it wasn't that easy to come by large amounts of gunpowder at that time.
Well, I was thinking this because there had been war with Spain, hadn't there?
Yes.
That had ended. So was there like a bit more knocking around than maybe there normally would have been? But even having said that, you're going to attract quite a lot of attention.
Yeah.
During a period of no particular warfare. And you know, why would you need it, especially in any sort of quantity? That's got to be a little bit of a...
Yeah, it'd be like today walking into a nuclear storage facility and saying, can I have 10 tons of uranium, please? And expecting to be given it.
Yes, if you don't melt before you leave.
Yeah, exactly. So that's been prorogued again. They have to have extra firewood, which they bundle up to hide it. We then get the last of the conspirators joining in October of that year, which is Catesby's cousin and his childhood friend, Francis Tresham of Rushton Hall. He's an interesting chap in the whole story. And he claims afterwards that he really didn't want anything to do with it, but Catesby wanted him involved because, again, he was filthy rich.
Yeah.
And obviously he had his father, who was a hugely important Catholic during the other period.
I suppose at what point I got the impression that Tresham was really, really reluctant, therefore probably the one with the most common sense out of all of them. But
yeah.
he really did seem to come into this against his better judgment. But I suppose there comes a point where you're so far in that you can't get out, because even if you came forward and said, well, you know, I've been involved in this, there's a pretty good chance they're going to kill you anyway.
Yes. Yeah. And you'll be implicated in it all.
Yeah.
And when we talk about the aftermath, they absolutely go, the authorities go loopy, as you would expect. And they're turning every place over that they can lay their hands on. Anybody who even had the slightest bit Catholic connection was also hauled in and questioned.
So in trying to do something monumental for the Catholic movement, it actually really spectacularly backfired because it had the opposite effect.
Exactly, yeah, and it drives them even harder against the Catholics because of it. There was a saying at the time, which they seems to have been sort of a code word for it, or a code phrase for it all, and that was when Tottenham turns French. At the time, it was an expression which sort of meant it's so unusual it's not going to happen. That's how it was used during the period, which I think is an interesting one. But then, of course,
introduce that into modern language again.
Yes. Yeah. When I do a talk on the Gunpowder Plot, I'm actually called the talk when Tottenham turned French, because I think it's such an outstanding thing to say. Anyway, so we then get to the stage where it starts to go horribly wrong, because Lord Monteagle gets this anonymous letter, and according to Monteagle, he rides to Whitehall and hands it over to Cecil. What we must also point out that Lord Monteagle is Tresham's brother-in-law.
Yeah.
So that's quite key into the whole story. Another suspected papist is Henry Howard, the Earl of Huntingdon and Earl of Northampton. He's told of it all, but the king's out hunting in Cambridgeshire, and nobody really knows where he is. He's somewhere in the middle of Cambridgeshire hunting, and so he doesn't come back. So we get this Monteagle letter. Monteagle's servant, Thomas Ward, who had connections with the Wright brothers. So again, there's another potential connection there. He sends a message to Catesby about the betrayal. Catesby had been due to go hunting with the king. So again, Catesby would have had the chance going hunting with the king to kill him. But even at this stage, even that he then suspects the plot's been uncovered, he could have taken the king out, but he doesn't. He continues to go ahead with the plan. So at this point, Catesby thinks it's Tresham who's written the letter. We were talking earlier, and I think there's a possibility that it was actually Cecil who wrote the letter, that he had found out about it, but needed a way to present it to the king in a suitable method. So he uses the Monteagle letter or the so-called Monteagle letter to get it over to the king.
Now, obviously, Monteagle is sort of not a very popular chap, is he? I don't think.
No.
And he is also fairly over. He's a recusant. He's a fairly over Catholic, still really as much as one can be in that period. So you would kind of think there would be no love lost between him and Cecil, really, and there wasn't, I suppose. But maybe that just adds weight to it. You know, it was such a bad thing to do that even a Catholic would be prepared to present this to a Protestant to overturn it.
Yeah, well, in theory, Monteagle would have been in the house when it blew up. So
and he knew that. I mean, the position that Tresham was in, a number of people that he was related and or associated with would have lost their lives had that explosion occurred. And that's a lot. It doesn't matter very few people, no matter how strong their religious belief, are going to want that sat on their conscience.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that does have a very strong motivation, I suppose, for possibly doing it.
But it's one of life's great mysteries, is it? This mysterious person turns up and hands a letter to Monteagle's servant, who comes in and goes, "Don't know, Gov, here it is."
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
I must ride like the wind immediately to this bloke I really hate and give him this letter.
Yeah, so although we know so much about it, we also have to remember that most of what we know is from one confession.
Yeah, which is
dodgy on its own.
Yeah.
So the possibilities are still quite endless, and there are lots of possibilities around.
Which is frustrating.
Yes.
Anyway, at some point the king comes back.
Yeah. While this is happening, while this is all going on, the hunting party meets up at Dunchurch, ready to go and abduct Elizabeth. So they're actually all in place, ready and waiting.
Yes.
And one of the other things as well is they go to, part of their plan was to go to Warwick Castle to steal the war horses, because at that point there were very few war horses left in England, and Warwick Castle was the last stables of them. So they were the big, powerful, strong horses. So that was also part of the plan as well.
The people they approached, or he approached, had the money, but they did have access to stables, or they had good stables, didn't they?
Yes.
So they could place horses at different points along the route, I believe, so that as they kind of came away, they had fresh horses to continue their journey.
Because they needed all this to do this. So Digby is up organising the hunting party. Percy visits the Earl of Northumberland to see if he can find out any rumours about what's going on about the Monteagle letter, which of course at that point there isn't a lot happening. Percy then returns to London, assures Winter, Wright and Robert Keynes that nothing to be concerned about, and goes off to his lodgings, which was in Gray's Inn Road. The same evening, Catesby, likely accompanied by John Wright and Bates, then set off for the Midlands. The letter is shown to the king on the 1st of November when he gets back in. He reads the word blow and felt that some stratagem, fire and powder had actually been part of it. They searched the buildings, first of all, around 4th of November. And interestingly, Monteagle is one of the searchers who actually goes and searches the Houses of Parliament. Underneath it, they find a large pile of firewood in the undercroft. And sitting there is supposedly a servant man who tells them that the firewood belongs to his master, Thomas Percy. He gives his name as John Johnson, but of course that is actually Guy Fawkes. Or Guido Fawkes.
Guido Fawkes, that's how he used to sign it. And there's actually two searches, I think, isn't there?
Yeah, the first search doesn't go anywhere.
And then, isn't it, the king goes, you're all idiots, or words to that effect, and I'm just, you haven't done it properly. Yeah. So I'm just going to go ahead and go in, and then if something happens to me, it's all your fault because you haven't sorted it out.
Basically, yeah. And he sends Thomas Knivet to go and do it. And again, they find Fawkes still sitting in this dark, dank, smelly, horrible undercroft. Yeah. But this time, he's in his cloak and his hat. He's wearing boots and spurs.
Ready to go.
Yeah. He's also got a lantern, a pocket watch, and several slow matches that would match being the cord that you would like to light the gunpowder, and the touchwood to do it. So they look a bit further. They find 36 barrels of gunpowder hidden under the faggots and coal. And Fawkes is taken to the king on the 5th of November. And he's investigated personally by the king at that point.
And that was quite unusual, wasn't it, I believe?
Yes.
For them to take somebody to the tower or whatever, and they would normally just be then gone.
Yeah.
Sorted out by whoever was the Cromwell of the era, if you like.
Yeah.
And but for him to actually but I believe that was kind of a little bit characteristic of James's personality. He kind of wanted to be in there and be seen as clever and
personally involved in all the decision making.
Yeah, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, to be fair.
No, not at all.
But we're led to believe very much that, like, the person who went Gunpowder Plot was James, and it hadn't occurred to anybody else. But
no,
we were talking about
that's what he'd like to see.
and we just can't see that Cecil, being Cecil and as shrewd as he was, either actually did have a backhand in it, or wouldn't, if the Monteagle letter really was the first thing he knew about anything, wouldn't have gone, yeah, that's a bit suspect, but I'll just sit here and wait around until the king gets back to see what he thinks.
Yeah. And you get the impression from looking at the contemporary sources that Cecil's trying his hardest to make James think it's his idea.
Yeah. Which is what a lot of people did with Henry VIII.
Yes. Yeah. Nothing changes with King.
There's a particularly good way of bum licking.
Yeah.
That seems to work very, very well over the course of time. And that's one of them. Yeah. And exactly. Cecil was nobody's fool, was he?
No, he was such a sharp bloke.
Yeah,
he really was.
As sharp as they come, really.
Yeah, and incredibly Machiavellian as well when it came down to it.
Yeah, for sure. That's another term that needs resurrecting. Anyway.
It is. I have got a T-shirt that actually says he's one of my heroes.
Right, well, next time I see you, I expect you to be wearing that then.
I will do.
So anyway, at this point, no, I'm John Johnson. No, I'm just here. No, we're going to cart you off. We know exactly what you're up to.
Yeah.
Then they work out, obviously, who this space is being leased to. And a warrant is issued for Percy's arrest.
Yeah.
But there's still 11 people missing.
Yeah.
So what happens then?
All the other conspirators are heading north as far away as they can get. They get to Ashby St Ledger, where they meet up with Robert Winter and they all discuss it all. They then go on to Dunchurch, where they meet with Digby. Catesby, at this point, whether he's delusional or what, but he convinces them that despite the plot's failure, the armed struggle would still work. And he announces to Digby's hunting party that actually tells them that the king's dead and Salisbury's dead, and nothing to worry about. It's going full ahead, which of course was complete rubbish.
I guess either, as you say, he was delusional, which seems quite likely, or he just felt so backed into a corner that he felt he had nothing to lose.
Yeah, but then we get to the next stage and you actually do start to think, perhaps he is an idiot.
Yeah.
Because they go on to Holbeach House on the border of Staffordshire, which was the home of Steve Littleton, one of the ever-decreasing band of followers, because obviously they were all just disappearing in all directions by this point.
He really thought a lot of people when he put out that the king was dead and they were going to create this big Catholic civil war.
Yeah,
that exactly. People would flock to him, and people they're just not that stupid.
No, not in the slightest. But they get there. They've brought loads of gunpowder with them for their muskets.
This is a great story.
Yeah, and because it was in open top barrels, they take it into Holbeach House, and then they spread it out in front of the fire to dry out.
What could possibly go wrong?
This is the bit that sort of you start to wonder how sensible these people really were.
I know.
Gunpowder doesn't actually explode unless it's contained in a small area. However, it does make rather a large fire, and a spark leaps out from the fire as they do.
Yeah.
Lands on the powder, and there's this big puffed. Imagine a firework today, that type of thing. And then the resultant flames engulfs Catesby, Rookwood, and Grant, and another man named Morgan. Rookwood and Morgan get very badly burnt, actually part of it, but Catesby and Grant, not so bad. Catesby gets off quite lightly. There's
a bit of an irony there, isn't there, really?
There is.
A micro version of what they wanted to inflict on other people actually came back on the behind. Yeah.
But all this time, of course, they're being chased by the authorities.
Yes.
And they turn up with 200 men. And
substantial. Yeah.
It's a large amount of men when you've only got about 8 actually inside the house.
Yeah.
And they surround the house on the 8th of November and go after them. If you go to the house, by the way, the house is now an old people's home. But if you manage to get up to the doorway, there are actually still musket ball holes in the door.
It's that's still amazing.
And you can go and see if you can get away with it. Catesby and Percy come running outside to see all these men, and there's a bit of a shootout. And reportedly, Catesby and Percy are both dropped with a single lucky shot that goes through both of them.
I heard that.
While they're standing by the door. Catesby manages to crawl back inside the house, where his body's later found clutching a picture of the Virgin Mary. And yeah, it's the end that you would want for him and the circumstances.
Martyrdom with the Virgin Mary. It doesn't get much better than that, does it?
No. But then he's buried afterwards close by. However, a few days later, the Earl of Northampton comes up and digs them all up, decapitates them, and puts all their heads on
spikes.
The walls of Northampton.
Just to make a point.
Just to make a point, yeah.
So while all this is, though, that was a lot better death than what he could have had
for the rest.
Yeah, exactly. The Who, so they take some of them back, don't they? And one of them is put in the cell next to Fawkes. I can't remember who it was now. And they eavesdrop on them, don't they?
Yes.
And that allows them to pretty much Tom Winter.
Yeah.
And they
and he's the one whose confession that they use for the story of what happened.
And that allows them to basically gather together everyone that hadn't already died.
Yes. Yeah.
And Tresham, obviously, we talked about Tresham earlier, and he actually kind of had a very random, lucky escape as well, didn't he? Because he ended up in the tower.
Yes.
But he got a water infection that was so severe that it
ends up killing him. Yeah.
Which seems unlucky, but on the surface,
it might have been better than what it would have been.
It was by far the lesser of two evils.
Yeah. So Guy Fawkes is continually tortured in increasing levels.
He held his tongue for a while, didn't he?
He did, and he was still insisting that he was, to start with, that he was John Johnson. And the plot to blow the king out was because he hates Scottish people. Mm. It isn't until later that he finally reveals what the whole true plot is about.
Yeah.
His third confession on the 9th of November then implicates Tresham, and we have all of that. His head actually as well, even though he hasn't been tried or anything, his head does end up on the walls of Northampton, and his body's thrown into a hole on Tower Hill with the rest of them.
Wow.
12th of November, Edward Fawkes returns to Harrowden Hall, and we'll talk more about the involvement of Harrowden Hall in the second part. And William Tate from Delapre Abbey surrounds them looking for Gerard, being the leading Jesuit priest at the time. For 3 days they search the house and they can't find him, but they know it's there. Mm. And Tate, the leader of the Inquisitors, threatens to start smashing down walls. Elizabeth, or Eliza Fawkes, tells him where the priest hole was, but of course they had so many priest holes in the house, they just told them an empty one, or there was one that was very little in, but they don't get him. So Elizabeth's then taken to London for further interrogation at that point. Also the Viscountess Wedman, who was the daughter of George Fermor, she was arrested along with her husband. And I love her thing at the time. Her husband, Sir Richard, testified that he disliked their intercourse because Mrs. Fawkes tried to pervert his wife. Now, you can make that what you like. That the modern terms have a completely different connotation to what they would have done at that time. Yeah, it just said she was talking too much, basically. That's what it meant.
Okay. Well, I'm sure he's not the first husband to have said that.
No, quite possibly, and probably won't be the last either. And then, so all of them will have a short trial in January 1606. Digby, Winter, John Grant, and Thomas Bates. Now, this is another interesting one. They go to be executed. Normally, you would be tied to the back of a horse's tail, and by the time you got to your place of execution, you were probably pretty nearly dead. So you wouldn't have known a great deal. But for these, they actually put them on hurdles, on flatbeds, to drag them through the streets, so they actually survive in good condition. So they suffer the full horrors of their execution. Digby's the first one to go onto the scaffold. He asks his spectators for forgiveness, refuses the attentions of a Protestant clergyman. He climbs the ladder to place his head on the noose. He's cut down while he's still fully conscious, because that partial hanging will quite often render you semi-conscious. But so he's fully conscious when he's castrated, disemboweled, and then fully quartered, and the others share all the same fate. So they're quite horrendous. The last one to actually die is Fawkes, and he must have been in an appalling condition with all the torture he'd gone through. But he goes up the ladder to the noose, and somehow manages to throw himself off the ladder and breaks his neck, so he doesn't have to suffer the rest. The same as what everybody else had done. And that's sort of the end of the story.
He'd ever done, really.
Yeah. And the one bit, just as sort of the add-on for it, is that first Baron Montague of Belton House, near Kettering in Northamptonshire, suggests that the king's apparent deliverance is divine intervention, and the 5th of November should be kept as a day of thanksgiving and making attendance at church mandatory to celebrate it. It's even written into the Book of Common Prayer that it should be remembered as a religious event at that point.
Wow.
Now the other ones are also executed as well, by the way. Keynes tries to jump off the hangman's noose and doesn't make it. They manage to catch him before he hits the ground, and he ends up getting it as well, as part of it.
It's just such a horror. I know what they were trying to do was consider, it was really horrible, but it's just such an unpleasant, awful way of killing somebody.
It is. It's frightening.
It's, we were saying this yesterday. What sort of brain do you have to come up with that?
Yes.
And then to just kind of go, yeah, you can do that. But then we're also sort of saying, a lot of the time, people invented these punishments, but they never actually saw them physically take place.
No.
And they may never even have met the people that they rained these punishments down upon. So if you actually had to do it yourself to a person, or you had to sit and watch this happen, maybe your stomach wouldn't be quite so strong.
Yeah, but you've also got to remember as well that, okay, they didn't use the full hanging, drawing and quartering so much, but even supposedly the clean executions, which was beheading,
hacking,
well, rarely happened. And if the king or whoever was instigating it didn't particularly like the person to be executed, or he'd done something particularly bad, they would get the executioner very drunk, or they would get an absolute novice, and it could take 8, 10, 12 blows to actually remove somebody's head. So that's just as
supposed to have happened with Cromwell, wasn't it? That somebody got, I don't know how true this is, but that somebody got the executioner a bit drunk and and
this happened all the time. Henry was quite well known for doing that, which is why when Anne Boleyn was executed, it was deliberately planned that it would be a very quick, clean death and use a sword, which is a lot quicker than an axe, and a poorly aimed axe at that.
Yeah. Oh God. I know it was of the time, and we have to remember that, but the horror of it never.
Yeah. You've got the story of with Henry VIII with Margaret de la Pole, or Margaret Pole, being executed, and the executioner chases around the scaffold with his axe, taking chunks out of her.
I mean, we know that that's not true, but you could almost imagine that it could have happened.
Yeah. Yeah.
It almost wouldn't surprise us if that happened.
No. But it's an example of the sort of thing that we know. Even Mary Queen of Scots, it took 3 blows to kill her.
Yeah. Oh God. So that's kind of where we left them with, as not that seems a bit blunt, really, but I get the impression it was a bit of a PR job for James as well. You know.
Yes.
Now God has come down and He's blessed Protestant Stuart England, and we got rid of Mary I, and then we thwarted the Spanish, and everything's great because it's Protestants.
Yeah.
And life for the recusants at that point, for Catholics, became 100 times worse than it had been previously.
Yeah, exactly. Interestingly, Gerard manages to escape, and he manages to get back to Europe. He's probably one of the few Jesuit priests that managed to. He had a charmed life, and he kept managing to escape from all the horrible situations that he was in. But
he was the one who kept getting himself back into lots of horrible situations.
Yes.
Some people never learn. He obviously had 9 lives by the sounds of things as well.
Yeah, and I think he probably used 8.5 of them up during this period.
Right. Okay. So that is kind of the Gunpowder Plot in a nutshell. Oh, and I read as well, I want to clarify this with you, that the bonfires were lit to celebrate when once everybody knew that Fawkes had been arrested and this plot had been foiled, and bonfires were lit the length and breadth of the country over time to sort of celebrate the fact that this plot had been uncovered and stopped. And that's why you sort of have the bonfire with the effigy on.
Yes, but originally it was the Pope that was on top of the bonfire, not Guy Fawkes. That doesn't come till a lot later. Which makes
sense, really.
Yes.
In the sense, because the Pope was all and this and that and all the rest of it. So that is where we are going to finish this part. And I'm probably going to put these out on different days. So if you're getting all excited, you're going to have to wait a day or two now. The best things come to those who wait. So we're going to take a little bit of a pause here then. All right. And then we'll come back in. And so the next part of the video is going to be talking about sort of all the backstories and the interrelationships and the subplots and things like that. Because as always is the case, there is so much to all these things. And it's all in these little intricate webs and things like that. And it's one of those things that we could talk about forever and ever. So thank you very much to Mike, and we will see all of you in the next video. Okay.